Hey everyone, it's Andy from Julo Computing. I just built a project with ASP.NET Core and the Cosmos DB through Microsoft's Azure services, cloud services. And I did that because I got a grant for a not-for-profit from Microsoft for a lot of services. And the Cosmos DB came out, at least according to their modeling, quite a bit cheaper than a regular relational database, even a Postgre or a MySQL. So I picked that so I could purchase other bells and whistles, and had to kind of feel my way through. There were some tutorials online which covered a lot of it, but I had to kind of peck around and pick and choose and put together a REST setup that worked well for me. So I figured I'd share it and put it out here on YouTube in case it's useful for anybody. Cosmos DB is they call it a distributed multi-model database, and what that means is it's distributed and replicated all over the globe if you want to, so that your customers can get data faster. And the multi-model is kind of neat. Basically, there are APIs where you can interact with this NoSQL database in ways that are familiar to you. So you can interact with it as if it's a MongoDB database. You can interact with it as if it's a GraphQL. And for the purposes of this tutorial, we are going to use the SQL API. One quick note before we dive into it, you'll notice in this video I have a little trouble with a debug versus release configuration. That did turn out to be just an issue with an upgrade on Visual Studio for Mac, and once I rebooted my computer, it all worked fine. So I tear my hair out a little bit fretting over that in this video, but it did all work out fine. It's just a little bug, not a good bug, because it caused me to write records to my development database instead of my production, but it does seem to be straightened out now. So without further ado, here we go.
All right. So first of all, I figured in the time it took me to get all these resources together and put this video out here on the web, that Microsoft would probably come along and do that documentation themselves. And sure enough, they did. There used to be that there was under the Build a Console app, there was .NET and there was a .NET Core example or a tutorial here. This is under the Cosmos DB tutorial page. And then under web app, they just had .NET and there was no .NET Core. So you could kind of get the feel for how .NET Core worked with the console app, but it wasn't really clear how you would create a connection string or a connection to the database that would carry through to different controllers. So they did fill that gap. But as I go through and I look at this is a little bit more complicated than I want from my scenario. There's more happening here. It's an MVC page, more happening here than I need, and I decided that I still kind of like the more simple solution that I came up with, that is just a REST API. So I figure we'll throw this out on the web. If it's helpful to you, great. If nothing else, it'll be a nice video that I can watch when I need to do this again and I've forgotten how I did it in the first place. So I'm going to go ahead and start a Visual Studio project. So I am using Visual Studio for Mac, which is going to have slightly simplified options compared to the Windows option. But essentially what we're looking for is .NET Core. We're looking for an API. And you'll see, I think the description is copied and pasted right from the Windows version, which I do have and should have checked. But this doesn't box you into just being a REST API. This can convert into an MVC application down the road. It's the same architecture, but it's just a little simpler template. So you can pick that or the equivalent of that on Visual Studio for Windows. It's just the API, .NET Core API. Your target framework, I'm going to pick 2.2. 3.0 will be out shortly, and if that's available to you, might as well go ahead and pick that or whatever the latest version is. And let's just call this Cosmos API. And I think I actually might have created one called that already. We'll just call it V2 for my purposes. I am not going to use Git here. I really have no intent of saving this. This is just going to be a throwaway for me, but if you're creating a project that you do want to use Git for, you can go ahead and leave that checked. All right, and while that sets up, and there we go. Shouldn't take too long. The other thing we need to do is, if you haven't done this already, is you need to have an Azure account. So you need to sign up. This is it's you can get one with a credit. So if you don't have an Azure account already, you can get a $300 credit to play. But do keep in mind that if you create a database here, that the your expenses are running. So if you've got the $300 credit, it's going to draw that down. If you don't, then you will be paying for it. So you definitely want to be if you create this database, you want to take it right out when you're done. But we are looking for a Cosmos database, which is over here on the left. Probably staring me right in the face. There it is. So I've got one already, but if you do add one, and this is all included in this document. So the fact that they've created this is great because they walk through the steps here of how to create an account, how to create a database. And so I'm just going to highlight real quick that the one thing you really need to be sure of for this tutorial to work, obviously the other options are your own to choose, but um, when they say, like I said, when I said that they say a distributed multi-model database, the multi-model is that there's an API, different APIs you can access this with. So you can access this as if it's a MongoDB database, Cassandra. You can use GraphQL through Gremlin, and we're going to use SQL. And we're going to use a SQL API to access a NoSQL database, which seems a little funny. But in this case with C#, that means you can use normal SQL query language. You can also use LINQ, which in my mind, when I have a series of tech stacks on the table and C# is in the mix, C# gets a big boost because of LINQ if I'm using lots of data, because LINQ is just really the best way to sort through data that I've ever encountered. I really enjoy using it. So make sure you've got Core SQL selected there, and you will create your database. And then you will have one underneath your Cosmos DB tab. And I've got one, it's called Falling Snow. All right, so when that's set up, we go back here to Visual Studio. Our project is created. If you would like, you can run it just to make sure it will work. It's fairly fast, so let's go ahead and do that. And it will come up on localhost 5001. That just gives you an opportunity to show you that everything is working. There's a base API that just feeds you value 1, value 2, or base controller. Okay. All right, so next thing we need to do is to go to the app settings and set it up to connect to our database. So under properties, or excuse me, under app settings right here, this is essentially our config file, and we've got two. We've got a config file here. We've got a config file for development. I know I said I assume some knowledge here on C# and .NET Core, so this is probably just a basic for you, but just to kind of cover what I'm doing and walk you through all the steps of it so I don't lose anybody. So this is for production here, this app settings, and then development is here. So when we're just running our debug mode, it will read out of this config file, and when we're running in release mode, it'll read out of the app settings.json. And in Visual Studio, you can change that so you can be in release or debug mode. And what I like to do here is go ahead and set up the connections, the items that we need to connect to the database. So I'm going to create a config value called CosmosDB. And then I'm going to give it a URL property. And then I'm going to give it a primary key property. And these are going to be what I refer back to make the connection to the database. And so these values are going to come from your panel or your portal on Azure. They are in your database. So you go click into your database, and there is a tab over here called Keys. And you are given a URL and a primary key. Obviously, I'm going to hit refresh and change this when I'm done. But right now, this is my primary key for this database. And this is my URL up at the top here. So we're going to grab this URL. We're going to pull it over here. We're going to paste it into there. So that's where we will point for the database. We will grab this primary key as well, and we will copy that into here. All right, I'm going to add one more property, and it's actually going to be outside of the CosmosDB object, but we're going to add one called database ID. And this is optional. You don't need to do this, but I'm going to call it, this just happens to be the project I'm in, but so you can call this whatever you want, but basically this is going to be the name of your database or the overall high-level collection in your NoSQL database. You can have several of these, which we're going to use here because this is going to be the production file, config file. When I am in release mode, I want it writing to this island line underscore prod production database. Now we're going to go to the development. Actually, I'm going to copy this. Not that last part, this part here. So I'm going to copy the CosmosDB object, the database object. I'm going to take it over to the development connection or app settings. And outside of logging, we're going to put a comma and we're going to paste this in, and then we're going to change this underscore to dev. So that makes sure it goes to the same database instance. It uses the same primary key. But if I'm running in debug mode, it is going to write to the development collection. And if I'm in release mode, it's going to use this config file and it's going to write to the prod collection. Not something you have to do. You could put the same database ID in there both times. You don't need to have the database ID in a config file. You can have it hard-coded in your controllers, but this is the way I set it up so that we can have a dev database and a production database. All right. Okay, so that's it for these config files, and I do want to save them. All right, and now we need to get some dependencies or some libraries here. So under dependencies, under NuGet, I'm going to actually go up here to project, add NuGet packages, because it's been locking up when I right click. All right, we want a couple packages here. We want I think you can just put CosmosDB. Yeah, not really. Okay. We're going to put documentdb.core. All right, so this is the one we want, Microsoft.Azure.documentdb.core. And you'll see right over here in the description, this client library enables the client applications targeting .NET Core to connect to Azure Cosmos DB via the DocumentDB SQL API, and that's exactly what we want. So we're going to go ahead and add that package. And while we're doing that, I think we can just go ahead and start stacking another package on there. We're going to add Newtonsoft, which is the second one that comes up. You might want to query it. You might already have it. It looks like in some of the latest releases of Visual Studio, they're just including it right in there. But in case you don't, just take that out there. Must have spelled Newton wrong. Okay, we're going to go ahead and add that. And that just assists, is a really, really handy library for, and there are all kinds of dependencies, so we'll just go ahead and accept that. Really handy library for converting objects to JSON and JSON back to objects. Really critical for your REST operations. Okay, next thing we need to do in setup is we need to change our startup so that our database connection happens there. And really just one line to add here. So right after your services, your add MVC right here, set compatibility version. We want to add another line right there. And we just want to add a singleton service that makes that connection to the database. And we only want to do that once. And if you are freaked out by not having autocomplete, I know we've all gotten used to it. I mean, you could just type along with me, but if you want it to autocomplete, you can go ahead and do your import first. And so we want to add Azure.documents and also Microsoft.Azure.documents.client. There we go. And now we've imported what we need here, and we will get singleton. All right. And we want of type I application builder. We're just going to nickname that app. And then the second parameter is I hosting environment. Oops. I'm sorry, I got on the wrong line. There we go. Forget that. I document client is what we want to create. And we want to spell that correctly. All right. And here's a little Lambda query for you, or Lambda syntax. All right. All right, so there we are passing it the URL, and we are, this notion right here, this is just pulling it out of our config file. And then we are going to pass it the key. All these commands are just long enough. They go slightly awkwardly off the screen, but not quite long enough to really wrap and have it look good. So hopefully you can see all that. It's kind of long, but this is passing the URL and this is passing the primary key to the singleton, and then the document or the connection to the database is made once on startup, and then you are all set to access it through a controller. All right, so that's all you need in the startup is to add that one line, and then of course you have to do these two imports here, which you can do first or you can do afterwards. Doing first will give you IntelliSense when you type. All right, so now we're ready to create a model. So I'm going to add a folder. We're just going to right-click here in the gray space. We want to add this out at the root level. We're going to add a folder called models, and we're just going to create a simple generic hackneyed items model. So we'll say new file. We're going to add new file. And we're just going to call this item.cs. It's just going to be an empty class. You can probably find a template for an object, but we'll just go ahead and start with a generic class and make it into our object. So we need to take this constructor out of here because we don't need this. Right. So our public class is going to be an item, and we need to add some properties to it, and we'll just go ahead and add. All right. And we will capitalize those because that, is what C# likes to see. We'll add an ID, we'll add a name. These properties are entirely up to you. This is your model of your object, and we'll just create a description as well. Give us something to look at on the test. There we go. We add a getter and setter to each one of those. Like I said, we capitalize that. If we lowercase it, yep, you get a little underscore there. This is not going to cause you any real issues, but you are going to get that underscore. That's not a typical naming convention for C# objects. You want your properties to be uppercase. All right, so there's our object right there. All right, so now we're ready to add a controller. Now we've got a values controller here. This is the one that comes out of the box, and it basically just returns a JSON object or string with the value 1, value 2, and that is what we saw here. We're going to add our own controller. And so we'll go add, we'll go to new file. There are templates you can use to create it. I am just going to do empty class. I'm not sure if there's a great template here on, yeah, they've got some. But it'll look a little different on Microsoft Visual Studio for Windows. So you know, if you find a template that works for you, great. I'm just going to go ahead and start from scratch because I think that that's we really don't need much here. We'll just go ahead and create our own controller. So the one thing we need to do though is make sure that it's named properly. So we're going to call it item controller, and the proper part is you just need to have controller here at the last part of it. All right, and to make this a controller here, I'm just going to use the base controller, which is just the very basic function. So this is going to extend controller base. And on a lot of this stuff, as you type it, you're going to get an underscore that you don't have it available, and you just want to import these items. So first we're going to import MVC, which has that controller base, which we're going to extend off of, and that just gives us some basic REST functions. There are other controllers that you can extend with more features. This one just has the base, which is really all we want. We don't want extra features getting in our way that we don't need. I prefer to go ahead up top here and go ahead and put the route or route, whichever part of the country you're from, right up here at the top. And I'm going to do API controller, which actually is the default. So I think technically this is not necessary, but I just like to have that right up on top of the controllers, just so it's very obvious when you open this where it goes. This is going to take the controller name, so it's going to be API/item, and it's going to drop the controller from the name of the class. You could hard code something in here. You could put API/myItems, and then that would map to this controller. You could put that in the URL, and it would map here. But by doing this controller in brackets, it just uses the name. So we could just put item here if we wanted to as well. And then we're just going to put API controller up here. And that makes this a controller that is mapped to API/item. And we're going to need a few variables at the top. We are going to need a private read-only document client. And we are going to name that underscore document client. And we are going to go ahead and import Azure Documents, which we need to do there. I'll get rid of that red line. And that is going to end up being our connection. We are going to have a read-only string. So this is like final if you're coming from another language, read-only or const. Database, it just makes it so you can't change it. You set it once in the constructor, and then the value is static from there. All right, we're going to have a database ID. We are going to have, oops, that's a collection ID. And then we're going to bring in our configuration, which allows us to access our config files. And we are going to only get, we have no desire to set in there. That should be a capital C. And then we will need to import the extensions, Microsoft extensions.configuration, and then we can access the config file. All right, so in our constructor, we are going to want to pass iDocumentClient. Wow, that was a nice autofill. iConfiguration. And we're going to want to set our underscore document client equal to the document client we are passed in the constructor. And that is going to be what we use to access the database. That's our connection. It fires up when the controller is created. It connects, and then we've got this document client as our route back to that connection to that database. And we want our configuration to be equal to the configuration passed to us in the constructor. And the database ID, we want to go ahead and get that from configuration database ID. So this is going to go ahead and get the database ID from our configuration file. So again, if we're in debug, it's going to get the development. If we're in production, it's going to get or if we're in release, it's going to get the production database. And then our collection ID, I'm going to go ahead and just set here at the top items. And this is what I like about this setup is that each controller can be set up to a different collection, which you're going to have to do some modifications to do on the current example that they have on the Microsoft documentation here. So this provides a way to do that. Every controller, and I only plan to have a handful of controllers here, every controller will change this so that each controller is controlling a separate collection in the database. And then we're going to want to build the collection, which is a function we have not yet built. And it's going to be async, so we're going to want to wait on it. And then we will go ahead and do that function. All right. And task is async, so we're going to need to import using systems threading.tasks. And we'll go ahead and put that async await to use right now. So there's our document client, that's our connection, and we're going to use a command called create database if not exists async. Nice succinct title there, but very descriptive. So we will create a new database with the ID equal to our database ID. So this, if it will check and see if the database exists. We're grabbing the database ID from the config file. If it exists already, it will do nothing. If it doesn't exist, it will create it. So every time this controller is constructed, it'll go and check. So if we do the debug, and we run it the first time, it creates a database, and then we're running a development for a long time. First time we go to release, we go ahead and run this, and it will create the database in the production environment for us for the first time. And again, this always runs, and if it's there, it just leaves it alone. All right, so once the database is built, then we want to build the collection. So we will do another await, and that is also an asynchronous task. That's why we use await. And we want the database to build first, then we want it to wait for the database to be done before we put the collection in it. So we are going to go to create document collection if not exists async. Another nice short title for us. And we want to create a URI factory, which just basically creates our reference. You won't get a drop down yet because we need to import the namespace for that, but go ahead and create database URI and at the database ID. So this gives it the location. And so we'll go to URI factory. We will import using Microsoft Azure Documents.client, and that will make that red line go away, perhaps. Oh, nope. I'm actually going to wrap this argument here. We've got one more parameter to provide, and that is new document collection. And the ID equals the collection ID. So we actually have to create the collection. And let's see, we closed that too early. So there we go. All right. So this gives it the database URI, directs it where to create the collection, and if the collection doesn't exist, it will create it at that space. And that is all we need for that build collection function. So this is something at the top here. All of this It's going to run every time, check for the database, check for the collection, and if it doesn't exist, it's going to create it. And the configuration here, we've got our database from our config file, and then we've got collection ID basically hard-coded here at the top for the whole controller, so that if you set up a second controller, you use all of this except that you're going to want to change the collection ID to another. So you might be able to extract this if you're building multiple controllers to kind of make it simple. But for the number of controllers I'm building, this is plenty transparent at the top. I like that. And even though I might repeat myself a little bit, it's not a whole lot of code to repeat. So then we can get into the actual CRUD operations. So we're going to start with a get or a couple of gets. So this will get everything. And we are going to start using link here a little bit, which we haven't imported yet, but we're going to bring that in a second, and that will make our squiggly red lines go away. So let's take care of that now. So iQueryable is part of link, so we want to import using system link. And our item, let's see if it gives us the option here. We need to import our model's namespace. Yep, it gives us the option right here. So we just need to bring in the namespace for the models so that we can use our item model. And we're going to use our document client as our connection to our database. So we're going to use that a lot here. We want to create a document query of a type, and that type is going to be item. That's what we're looking to get back. There's our URI factory, which is going to create our reference. Create document collection URI is the one we're looking for here. And the URI is going to be gotten from passing it the database ID and the collection ID, so that it knows what it's getting. And we do need one more option here. So before that last paragraph, this is where we're going to pass the feed options, which may actually be optional, but you can certainly just include them and do this for later. Or you can add an option in there. So if you only want to get a certain number back, so you might not want to just have a completely open-ended query. There's some options you can pass here. One is max item count. So let's just say, when I say get all, I mean just give us 20, top 20. All right, and our next HTTP GET, pretty common in a RESTful controller. Is going to be get one. So we're looking for an iQueryable of type item, and that's also a get. And cursor troubles here. All right, create document query. Same as before, and also an item. We also want a URI factory here, so this is kind of a common pattern. This is basically, we could have copied and pasted if we wanted to. Oop, I'm getting off there. All right, and so same thing as below here, but this time we want new feed options, just like before. But this time I'm going to say max item count equals 1. Now, I mean, our intent here is to only grab 1 by the ID, but if we somehow the IDs are duplicate, we've kind of slipped up and allowed that to happen in our database. This will only grab 1, and so we can handle that scenario. And this is where we start using link, which is a good thing. Gets me excited anyway. All right. I.id equals our ID. So we're only going to grab the record that equals the ID that we pass. And we can pass that ID up here. So when we say get, we want to get string ID. And our HTTP get, oh my goodness, where am I? Yeah, okay, I'm in the right button. HTTP get, we also want to tag that and say, yes, we're going to get a parameter called ID from there. All right, so these are basically the same, HTTP get and this HTTP get, except that we have also decorated that to let it know that it's going to get an ID parameter from the query string, and put it down here in the function as well, and then we add the where clause at the end. All right, so let's do a post, and then we can do a little bit of a test just to make sure we haven't totally messed any of this up. All right, so we do a put request and not a per request, a put request. And same thing as above, we're going to want to pass it an ID. Nope, sorry, I'm skipping ahead to put. We don't want to do put yet. Let's do post. Post request first so that we can actually have something to update later. So let's add async task iaction result. And there's a number of ways to get information back from a post in .NET, but we're going to use an iaction result, which is just going to send us an HTTP code that lets us know that everything is okay. A 200 code if it works. Okay. Iaction result. I need to capitalize A. And post is all set there. Okay. So I'm going to do a response here. So I'm going to set a var variable called response, and it's going to await on the document client. And we are going to create a document async, and we're going to use that old familiar URI factory. So the patterns hopefully are starting to become apparent here. The URI factory is basically just to create a reference in the database. And we are going to create document URI from a database ID, a collection ID, and we are passing it an item. And create a document, and that should be create document collection URI. That will make that go away. All right, and then we need to return something. So I am going to return okay. So obviously you really probably want to have some try catch block, return something here if there's an error, but just in a simple setup, it posts that information, adds it to the database, and returns an okay. This response is underscored because we're not doing anything with it, and it isn't needed. You could take this out entirely, but I just wanted to show you how you could do that. And there's all kinds of different things you can get from the response object. So if you want to pass that information or want to use that information, it's there. So I'm going to just go ahead and leave that there, but you could definitely take this out and just do, if you're not interested in any of the information, you can just do await. All right, so that gives us a post. And so now I'm going to go to Postman, and let's actually test and make sure that some of this is working. So we'll go ahead and hit go. That will bring up, I'm going to just close this because it will bring up a new instance of the tab. And once it's up and running, we're going to bring over Postman. And there it goes. And it defaults to API values. So we could change that to not items, but we called it item. And that will connect to our database and pull us all of our item objects, which is none right now. So we can add some so we can start to get some more meaningful tests. So I'm going to go over here and we're going to go to Postman, and so what we want to do is create a post. We want to create it to localhost 5001/API/item. We want to go to headers and make sure we have content type application JSON set up. Don't think we need that one. And in our body, we are going to create an item. So we'll create, I'm going to go to raw in the body, and we'll create this object that's got a name of my item. We'll just call it my item, and we'll call it my item description under description, and I'm going to hit send. And I get back a status to 100 OK, which is what we asked it to do. And so if we go to our database and we go to Data Explorer, if we're lucky, we're going to see some information there. And let's see, it's in here it is in our inline prod, which is not what I expected to see. So let me figure out what I did there. Did I have it? I built it in debug, right? Well, I guess we won't worry too much about that, but we have our items right here. So you can see they are right there. And let's see, I've got an ID, I've got a name, I've got a description, and then I've got a secondary ID, and the ID is null. So this doesn't necessarily look the way we want it to. We've also got capitalization in here, which we don't necessarily want in a NoSQL database. We generally want camel case in there. So this doesn't look the way I want it to. So I'm going to go ahead and delete it and take this out. Let's start over. So what we need to do is go to our model, and we need to annotate it. So what we need to do is create a little bit of a bridge for working in C# with properties that want capital letters, and then working in NoSQL, which wants camel case. And we can easily do that in our model. And this is where we will use Newtonsoft, or one of the areas we'll use Newtonsoft. What did I do? There we go. All right, so I'm going to bracket there, not a comma. And Newtonsoft.json.json property. And we are going to set the property name equal to ID. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to have an ID object or ID property with a capital I on our object, and in the database it is going to be mapped to a lowercase ID. And so we'll take that and we'll just copy it, and we will paste it over the rest of our fields, and then we will change it to the name of the field that we want in the database. And that's the same thing, except we just want lowercase. That's what we're just trying to accomplish with this. All right, we're going to stop that. We're going to clearly say, hey, I want debug here. And then we're going to hit go. And I'm going to go back to Postman, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing. Okay, it's ready for me now. Oop. All right, we're going to send now. We're going to get our OK 200. We're going to go back here. We're going to hit refresh. All right, now you can see you've got your name, you got your description, you got your ID. And so there's only one ID where there was a lowercase ID, there was an uppercase ID before, and the uppercase ID was null. So we didn't give it an ID. It generates one on its own. You can specify it and you can pass it to it, but if you leave it out, it's going to generate one on its own, and it will be in that lowercase tense right there. And so that looks good. And now we can do a second one just to give us something to look at. We will call it my item 2, my item 2 description will be wicked creative here. And we'll hit refresh, and then we can see we've got my item 2 description right there. And then that gives us something to check our get from. So a get request to HTTPS localhost 5001. If you're using this Postman for the first time with ASP.NET Core, you might get a warning here from Postman about the SSL certificate being self-signed. If you do, you can go to preferences, or I think it's called settings here. You want this SSL certificate verification off because it's just a self-signed certificate. The API is using HTTPS by default, which is kind of nice, but it is just a self-signed certificate. So Postman might throw up a warning or block you unless you turn that off. So, you know, if you're dealing with a situation where you need that verification, you can turn it on. But in this case, it just gets in our way. You need to turn it off. And you should be able to pull up a single one using an ID. So we'll grab this ID and say, hey, I just want all of it. I just want that one record. And so you paste this afterwards and you just get the one. And if you leave that off, you should get both of them. Beautiful. All right. So let's just wrap this up with a put request and a delete request real quick, and then we will call it a wrap. So back to our controller. Um, we'll do a put request, and we, just like we did up here, in fact, I'm just going to go ahead and copy let's just get the basic syntax from up here, try to speed things up a little bit. All right, we don't want get, we want put. And here we don't want get, we want put. I probably would have been just as quick to type it. And yeah, actually, we don't even want we don't want an iQueryable, we want a task with an action result. I should just type from scratch. So what I get when I try to be lazy, I end up working harder. All right, iAction result, put request, and we do need a string, but we do also need, from the body of the request, we are going to need the item so that we can update it. And here we want to await as usual. As usual, we're going to use our document client. And it's giving me a trouble there because I did not put async up front. And it clearly didn't do something else either. Oops, oh, we're getting crazy here. There we go. Document client, replace document async. And there we go. URI factory is going to give us our reference, and we're looking for a very specific reference here. So we want to go right into the database, we want to go into the collection, and then we want to go right into the item using the ID, and then we return it. We return our OK. Right. Okay. Lastly, we just need to delete it. We'll just type this from scratch after our last experience. Now, for some reason, I didn't think that was right. Wasn't lighting up with the IntelliSense like I liked. It's funny how how dependent we get on IntelliSense to tell us that we're doing things that we know we're doing right, but we don't feel we're doing right until they light up to a certain color. All right. It's crazy with the tabs. And we're awaiting this. This is everything's async. And this is delete document async. And we're just URI factoring. We want to create a document URI. And this one's going to be very, very specific as well, because we want to make sure we're grabbing the actual document that we intend to. So it's just like the put, except we're not passing the body into it. In fact, I forgot to pass the body to it here. And let's go back up to the put. I should have had a comma here and then return, or actually passed in the item, because otherwise it's got nothing to update off of. So that's the difference between that. It didn't seem right. That's the difference between the delete and the replace, is not only that you're calling a different item here, but you're actually passing the object into it to be updated on the put request, whereas they don't, you don't care on the delete. You're just giving it the ID. So okay, and I'm actually seeing I have a missing bracket here in my ID. That's I think actually stopping it from starting. So let's fix that. All right, once it's fired up, we can create a put request. So in Postman, put request, same address, and we want to actually capture the ID of one of our items. So let's go to, well, we'll just go to this one here, grab it. We want to put that up here in the URL. All right, and we'll want to create our raw JSON. So we want to set our headers to content type application JSON. That's not needed. So just this one here, application JSON. And then our body, we want our name, we want the description, and we want the ID. It's right there. All right, and then we can go ahead and send that. Actually, let's change it. Just a little bit. All right, we'll send that. And we can refresh our data here. My item, new name, my item with new description. So there we go. And you know what? Let's go ahead and we'll just copy that ID again. Probably already got it on the clipboard, but delete, same address, /item, /ID number, send, get our 200. We go verify in our database. We refresh, and we see only one item left, so we get rid of it. So that's just a simple REST setup with CosmosDB on the back end and ASP.NET Core doing the REST operations. And I think so for each controller, you just create basically the same thing. I mean, very little needs to change here other than the type of item that you're passing in for a post or a put request. And then up top, you want to reset your collections. I haven't quite figured out why it's reading the production config string versus that. So that's something that I did incorrectly and I need to monkey with. But you know, if you're coming to this with a little bit of knowledge, you probably already know what I did wrong, or you can figure it out on your own. All right, so why don't I go ahead and wrap it up there? Hopefully this is of some use to you. This was kind of an interesting little project for me. Got to stitch together some things that I haven't done before, and it was fun to throw together. So hopefully you found this video useful and you enjoyed it. And thanks so much for watching. Take care.